Today, oh, what a tangled web we weave. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today I'm joined by Robbie Barwick from the Citizens Party. Hi Robbie.
Hi Martin.
And boy, we're going round and round in circles, and we watch our politicians making a bigger and bigger sort of wave, and we see more and more about how the sausage is made, and it doesn't look very pleasant.
No, it doesn't. We've got two issues to talk about. An update on Australia Post, which has just gone to the dogs. It's ridiculous, very disturbing, and just shows you how completely dishonest the attack on Christine Holgate was. And the bank regulator, APRA, revealing by its own behaviour that it's been dishonest to the Parliament about the true nature of the stability of the banks in Australia. So, and the consequences of that are dire. It completely defines our economy. So we need to expose it as the first step to combat it.
Yes, and it's very interesting watching the interaction between parliamentarians working within Parliament, right? And you would assume that they would be above criticism, trusted, looking after the best interests of Australians. But again and again and again, what we see is partisanship and interests aligned to particular power groups, and not real focus on the fundamental issues that we should be thinking about and talking about.
Look, in the historical fact, in the 1940s, both the Liberal Party and the Labor Party in Australia had in the order of something like 400,000 members each. So in other words, they had a membership base that signed up to their ideological position, if you want to call it that, and was so large as a percentage of the population, it represented that view in the population. Right, so the belief, the principles of the parties was connected to the public that it represented, the constituencies it represented. Australian politics is completely different to that now. These are not mass-based parties with mass support, and that mass support has been replaced by an ever greater reliance on sectional interests. Right, and you turn around, and it's the sectional interests that are influencing the policies at every step of the way. And people, it's a gross distortion of our system. I still see it as a symptom of the neoliberal takeover of Australia, right? Because neoliberalism essentially makes democracy for sale anyway. Everything's for sale. The market principle governs everything, including democracy. That plays out in the policies that the governments introduce. It's all they know what to do, and they'll bend any rule to get themselves re-elected. Not because when they're in power they want to follow through on their fundamental principles that they think is for the best interest in the country, so that when they're in the power they can deliver for the sectional interests. And that's a broad truth. There's always little contradictions within that, right? And what we would do is we find those contradictions, we find those people. On any given issue, you'll have politicians that are otherwise sellouts. They'll be confronted with an issue and it's just too much. And then they'll express a personal opinion on that and get fired up for a while, etc. And you get a glimpse into how the system works. And then, it's the exception that proves the rule, in a sense. What we're working on is strengthening more of that, right? Getting their conscience back in there by making them aware that there's a general public out there who they should be listening to, right? We've never tried to represent a sectional interest in any of our campaigns. These are always policy positions first, right? And they get support in the public, and then we tell the public who supports those policy positions, whether it's a postal bank or Glass-Steagall or those things we've campaigned on against the cash ban. Okay, this is a policy position you support for the reasons you support it. You express that to the powers that be, right? And if you do it in a focused way, sometimes you can make breakthroughs. So, but this is not today's show is not a show about the breakthroughs. It's a show about just got to shake your head at how bad it gets.
And I will just add one thing, Robbie, and that is the other fundamental thing that I see is that the leadership groups within Parliament believe that the taxpayers' money is somehow their money, right? And they can choose where to spend it and how to spend it, and try and actually obfuscate and hide rather than actually being transparent. The car parks rorts is the latest and greatest, right? Where it's quite clear that essentially money was thrown at particular areas to try and win votes. And we've seen even at the state level in New South Wales, the Premier here basically saying, that's fine, basically, running schemes to put money in particular areas to buy votes is fine. Hang on a moment, that's our money you're spending, right? You don't have my permission to do that.
Well, but Martin, I think you're being unfair. How else are they going to get support? They've got nothing else to offer. What do they actually have to offer? Unless it's some short-term fix for the electorate, right? Maybe what else do they have? But and the worst part about this, as you know, is there's a few issues that Labor's able to grandstand on against the government in this, but fundamentally, if the shoe was on the other foot, it wouldn't be any different.
Yeah,
right.
It is the nature of the beast at the moment, unfortunately, and we've lost our way completely in terms of the vision thing, in terms of thinking about the strategic future for Australia and Australians and what needs to be done. Right? There is an alternative narrative that can be built and propagated, except that currently today both sides of politics are playing the wrong game.
Yep, and how small-minded do they think Australians are if the way to buy their votes is through a car park?
Well, eventually it's gonna come out. And look, the steps that we're taking to try and raise some of those issues and to show how politics actually is working is part of the story of getting ordinary Australians to get angry and get frustrated, because that's the first step of actually driving change, which is change is what we need. But let's go to Australia Post, right? Because this is now, I don't know. It's completely gone off the rails.
If you want to get angry, you've got to get angry at this. So there's been a breaking development since you and I talked last night to plan this show. But we'll start at the general point. The reason we decided to do this show is because the news broke last week, at the end of last week, that there's been a bunch of executives at Australia Post follow Christine Holgate out the door. And some of them have followed her to Global Express because they love working under her, and some of them have just left. And the problem for Australia Post is they got a new CEO who starts next month now, the guy that they announced the day before the first hearing in their bloody-minded arrogance and scorn for the due process of the inquiry. So they announced this guy. He starts next month, and he's probably not I don't have any intention to judge him except by his results, right? He's probably not the worst guy in the world. In fact, I've heard good things about him. But he needs some kind of continuity because you can't successfully take over a business, right, which is as unique as a post office, and not have people there at the executive level who know how it works, right? So Australia Post is getting desperate. And in their desperation, what have they been doing? They have been paying retention bonuses to keep people in their jobs. Now, let me just explain that, because this term bonus was thrown around too much in this whole scandal, right? So first of all, the watches were never a bonus. They were an award, and purely a symbolic award, an expression of recognition for a job well done. And, I think the regular viewers of the show will know for the spectacular reasons of the banking deal that was so great, right? That's what that was. They were called a bonus. No, that wasn't a bonus. Then there's this other thing that to do with Australia Post executives that were called bonuses, which were also not bonus. They were incentive payments. And the top level executives always had their pay structured so that half of it was base pay, they always got, and the other half was the incentive payment, which is what they signed up to. This was a system they signed up to, that if they met their KPIs, they got this incentive payment, which for a lot of them was double, right? So now that's we can have that's, as I said in the past, it's a whole separate issue of whether Australia Post executives are too well paid, right? As essentially people who work at a public enterprise. But that's a different thing. The people working there didn't invent those rules, right? The people who in Parliament who then make an issue of this sort of stuff are the ones who invented the rules. And it was Labor Party who actually invented these specific rules. So Australia Post has these high paid executives. It's not the fault of the executives that they're highly paid. That's just the system. But they're well paid, right? And Christine Holgate did not give bonuses. She gave watches, $5,000 watches as rewards. And frankly, in the overall scheme of Cartier watches, they were pretty cheap ones, right? You can get $500,000 Cartier watches. These were $5,000 Cartier watches. And they were truly very well deserved for what they had achieved. She got monstered 2 years later over that. Everyone knows the story. But the most germane part to this discussion is that in the wash-up, in the Senate hearings that were held following that, the chair of Australia Post, Lucio Di Bartolomeo, and the board, to the Senate, to the special inquiry that had been set up by Maddox lawyers, insisted repeatedly that they would never, ever, ever have approved those watches, right? Tut, tut, tut. No, no, no. We would never have approved those watches. That's the worst thing we could possibly contemplate. And the board pretended they didn't know about it. And the chair, who, in his defense wasn't there at the time, it was afterwards, he threw Christine under, but I would never have approved $5,000 watches. Well, that same board and that same chair are now approving retention bonuses in desperation to keep staff beyond the salary and beyond the incentive payment of $250,000. The 4 watches added up to $20,000. They're approving incentive payments of $250,000 per person that they're giving these retention bonuses to, right? This is, like, I spoke to the LPO people. They were physically sickened by this news because it was bad enough they had the best CEO they've ever had, and they knew it was unjust that she was ripped away from them on the basis of $20,000 watches, and then they watched this board and this chair throw under the bus and claim they would never have approved $5,000 watches as rewards. But now the same people, obviously with the government's permission, Minister Paul Fletcher's permission, right? And if Paul Fletcher knows, Scott Morrison knows. So Mr. She can go, because $20,000 in watches is the single most immoral thing this person has ever heard in his whole life. Right? Even though he's best friends of a man who's protected pedophiles and is now on charges for that. No, those watches were the worst things ever heard in his life. He and his government is now approving $250,000 bonuses to keep Australia Post executives. Sorry, it is infuriating, right? There is nothing redeemable about this government. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Paul Fletcher, Scott Morrison, you can go. This is outrageous. They set up the system that Australia Post is crumbling now. Australia Post is hemorrhaging talent because those people who probably have a modicum of decency don't want to be in that cesspool of corruption anymore. They set that up. And that does not justify them just rubbing everyone's face in it and turning around and saying, here, have $250,000, because suddenly taxpayers' money doesn't matter, right? This is justified. No, the watches were justified because that woman, Christine Holgate, and that team saved regional banking services in Australia. They did a thing that most of us had no clue was an issue, had no clue what was happening. But when you find out after the fact, you think, man, that was good they did that. Boy, how bad would it be if 1,500 communities in regional Australia had no banking services whatsoever? That woman saved them under extreme duress, and she was crucified for it because she got in the way of bankers and she got in the way of privatisers. And now they turn around in their sheer arrogance, say it doesn't matter. Let's pay these retention bonuses. So, sorry about that, Martin. But I have lived this.
Absolutely justifiable indignation. Absolutely justifiable. Yeah. I
have lived this for 9 months. I've never felt. I mean, and when you feel for someone, it's not a unique issue. When you feel for someone, it's just so outrageous, so corrupt. And I detest this man who's our Prime Minister because he's a sanctimonious religious nutcase to boot. And I hate that kind of religious sanctimony that he hides behind, right? And you know, it's the worst reflection on Australian politics and the Liberal Party, what it's become, that this man is the Prime Minister, this person. And I might have told you in the past, I've spoken to top Liberals who support it, who are big donors to the party, who are personally revulsed by this individual as their Prime Minister, as the leader of their party now, right? But based on what he did to Christine Holgate. So that's what has sickened the LPOs, that they're just, you know, it just proves the whole thing was bogus. If you, the viewer, the one who is tempted to make a comment now, or the readers in the Australian newspaper who make their comments, who say it's all about the watches, yeah, she shouldn't have given those watches, get this through your head. It had nothing to do with watches. It had nothing to do with taxpayers' money, and these retention bonuses prove it. And then the real worry today is, what's the latest news is the breaking news is that one of the executives, very high-ranking executive, Nicole Sheffield, she didn't get a retention bonus, and she's left. And she's left to go to work for Wesfarmers, you know, Coles. Now, I happen to know that when Christine Holgate was there, under the right leadership, this executive was very, very, very good at her job. Right? She actually ran the division that covers the licensed post offices. She was exceptionally good at her job. She flourished under the leadership Christine Holgate provided. Unfortunately, she was at such a high level that she got caught up in all the drama, the plot about Christine Holgate, etc., and the way she chose to act there is her issues, but she didn't exactly cover herself in glory. Except her departure really does show that Australia Post is hemorrhaging. Right? This is an organisation that's falling apart, and it's our post office that's falling apart. And this new guy is going to have to pick up the pieces. It shouldn't have to happen. And it's happening because a Labor senator, Kimberley Kitching, decided to dig up an issue from 2 years earlier to attack Christine Holgate over for her own reason. The Labor Shadow Minister, Michelle Rowland, then raised it in question time. The Labor opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, lied and connected the watches to the pandemic recession. And then the Prime Minister went on the biggest, most, craziest, most disgusting bullying rant anyone's ever witnessed in the Australian Parliament against this woman who was so good at her job. That politics, they played politics with this institution, these people's lives, and now it's literally falling apart. So that's what happens. You go down that path, right? There's consequences, but it's not consequences to Scott Morrison, right, or Kimberley Kitching. It's consequences to the Australian people and to the LPOs. Those LPOs know they now have to go through the drama of, not just having lost their CEO, but now they've got to, they're in trepidation. What's the new guy going to be like, right? Is he going to see that these important issues need to be, the LPOs are an important factor that need to be taken care of, and or are we going to go back to the bad old days, or are we just going to become victims of dysfunction because of all this? They had 3 great years out of 30 bad ones, right? And they're going to become victims of vindictiveness, or just basic dysfunction because the whole thing's falling apart?
And of course, the other point there, Robbie, is that if, in fact, they're having to pay a lot of money out the door just to keep people in the organisation, it means that money isn't then available for the development of the business. And it comes then fundamentally back to, they'll claim that this is economically unsustainable, etc., etc. You can see all the spin coming ahead, right? And guess what? They'll be back to, right, we need to close post offices again, right? So we're back to square one, effectively.
No, exactly. They have that in their back pocket. Even though we have exposed the privatisation agenda and that sort of thing, that they'll set it up. If they turn Australia Post into a basket case, people will swoop in and make that argument. That brings me to the last update to do with Australia Post, is that the news, most people might have heard last week that Christine Holgate reached her personal settlement with Australia Post, and she's got a $1 million payout. So first of all, for the record, that $1 million is just essentially what she was owed under her contract. This is not a payout like her predecessor Ahmed Fahor got when he walked away with $10 million, right? She was never in this for the money. So that's all that was. She's happy to be out of there, right? This last period was a terrible period of her life, and she was happy to be out of there. The mediation with Australia Post, I understand from my sources, was horrible. It required certain interventions by certain politicians to kick Australia Post ass and say, stop bullying this woman, just go to the mediating table and fix this. So they finally, and so she's out of there. But the day that news broke, I got a reply back from Australia Post to my freedom of information request. Now, you and I talked about this a little while ago. The news came out about a month ago that two of the four big banks, NAB and CBA, had agreed to renew their deal for Bank at Post, where post offices can serve their customers, for 10 years. And on paper, that was excellent news, long-term certainty for the LPOs, because this deal involved them, paying Australia Post to do this. And of course, that was the deal that Christine Holgate had used to save the LPOs and turn Australia Post fortunes around. So despite all the chaos, the banks had agreed to renew, or two of the big four had agreed to renew it, and they'll renew it for long term, 10 years. So this is a great commitment. But then something suspicious occurred to us, which is that, hang on, they're not giving the details of the deal, like how much money they pay. Whereas 3 years earlier, Christine Holgate had broadcast this from the rooftops. The banks had agreed to pay $20 million a year for this deal. Why aren't they agreeing? Why aren't they saying what the new amount of money is? Is it more? Is it less? There's a reason it was $20 million that Christine Holgate had asked for. It took that level of investment to make sure that the Bank at Post system worked properly. So they didn't say. So I put in a freedom of information request. I said, what is the price that you've agreed to pay for the community representation fee? And it took about a month, and they replied and said, we don't have to answer that because that is commercial in confidence. Australia Post's commercial activities are exempt from freedom of information. And I replied to them because I pointed out two obvious things. First, that's curious to claim, given that the same information had been made very public 3 years earlier. So that doesn't gel. Second, it's now very famous that when Christine Holgate was asked in Parliament about the watches for which she awarded executives for this deal 3 years earlier, she said that was a commercial decision because this is a commercial issue. That was her excuse. And did that fly? Was that accepted, that this is commercial? No. The government insisted, forget commercial, this is about taxpayers' money. So it's the same deal we're talking about. If Christine Holgate didn't get away with that excuse and actually lost her job over it, how can Australia Post turn around 8 months later and use the same excuse to deny the public information about this deal? Right? So I've asked them that, haven't got a reply yet, we'll see. But here's what's alarming. Word on the street is, and from good sources, it's actually $10 million, half. The banks agreed to pay half of what they did last time, plus they have, in the 10 years, as every 2 or 3 years, they would have points where they can actually reconsider the whole deal. So it's not absolutely set in stone. It's going to be a 10-year deal anyway, right? But the half is what's alarming, Martin, going to your point a second ago, because it undercuts the sustainability of the service, right? The way it works is Christine Holgate had to ask for $20 million because it required a lot of investment in technology, a lot of investment in training, a lot of investment in infrastructure like safes and other sorts of equipment. It required that, and other kinds of infrastructure that might, and training, etc., that might not immediately occur to people. So, for instance, in regional areas especially, it's still a cash economy. A lot of people use cash, right? And Australia Post is a source of that cash, as it should be. However, you don't want Ma and Pa running the LPO to accept, $10,000 or $15,000 in cash across the counter from some guy who gets it from his hydroponic operation down the street where he's growing something that looks like parsley, right? There has to be some. You've got to be aware of those things, right? And that takes training. That takes a certain amount of infrastructure to deal with that. Security is an issue, etc. And so this costs money. That's why it was $20 million. The technology investment is never ending. You invest in technology, you're always up. Anyone who deals with computers knows that. You're always upgrading, right? That's what the $20 million was for. And now they've set this up so that at a certain point, Australia Post will be looking at the $10 million and saying, look, this isn't covering it. And what they did 3 years ago was say, this board, the same board, 3 years ago had said, well, we'll scrap the service then, because they didn't care that it's going to rob 1,500 communities in regional Australia of banking services, right? Only Christine Holgate cared. So that's another dimension to this, right? The bastardry of the powers that be, this government, this board, is on display for all to see, and the banks. The banks are a huge part of this. They definitely took advantage of the chaos in Australia Post and Christine being out. They definitely didn't want her to have start a postal bank, right? And now she's gone, and they've got the upper hand, and they're screwing down for all it's worth. And that brings me to what we should always be focused on is the big picture here that can solve this. Look, that's what, right now, Australia Post at the mercy of the private banks. Let's create an Australia Post Bank. Your deposits will be guaranteed because it's a government-owned enterprise. It's not going to go broke. It'll guarantee service. Nobody can be debanked at a publicly owned institution like that. It's not private. It can't discriminate against anybody like all the private banks are doing at the moment. It'll guarantee service in general across Australia through the Australia Post network, the best retail footprint of any organisation in the country. Everyone will be within, like 95% of Australians are within something like 5 kilometres of a post office, right? It'll guarantee service, and it will attract a flood of deposits, and it can put those to use. We're building the campaign for this. Bob Katter is fully committed to introduce legislation for this in Parliament. He got tied up with the COVID lockdown in Queensland, though, so he's not there at the moment. So when he's there, at the next opportunity, he wants to do that. We've got local councils around Australia are endorsing the postal bank bill. The latest one is Banana Shire Council up near Rocky in Queensland endorsed it, and that got in the Courier Mail newspaper, or the Rocky Morning Bulletin, and the Courier Mail website covered it. The Narrabri Council endorsed it up there in northern New South Wales, and they endorsed it because it's just after the town of Wee Waa, which is covered by the council, lost their last bank, right? And they only have the post office to use as a bank. A lot of our supporters are going to councils all around Australia, getting them to endorse this. And then once they endorse it, show the local member of parliament, this is what we want, and we're building a groundswell of support for this policy. And everything from the government and Australia Post behaviour just confirms of how absolutely important this will be as a long-term solution.
Absolutely. Well, we need an alternative approach, right? Because the current approaches are absolutely not in the best interests of broader Australians. And if you want another example of that, right, we'll just briefly talk about the Freedom of Information request that the Australian published yesterday relating to APRA and Wayne Byers. Now, this related back to April, right? And that was around the time that both Phil Lowe and Wayne Byers were saying, we're very happy with the way that lending is running in Australia. We don't see any issues with mortgages, et cetera, right? Except that the letter that Wayne Byers sent to the banks without actually public disclosure was much more concerned about their lending standards and all the things that they needed to do to make sure they weren't actually going off the rails with low interest rates. So we have this sort of diversity between the public voice of our regulators and reality, and the public voice that was actually spilled over into parliamentary evidence against the reality of what the regulator is thinking about what the banks are doing. Another example of the banks not actually doing the right thing and our regulators not doing the right thing.
And this is in the context, this is against the backdrop of the whole responsible lending debate, which at the time you and I were doing shows about. We know the drama in the Senate to try and get the Senate to pass this law. They've actually failed, thank goodness, because there's a pretty good balance in this Senate at the moment. But the government was pushing this, right? And as if, and the assumption of the responsible lending debate, as you know, Martin, based in the wording of the bill, is that responsible lending rules are getting in the way of an economic recovery. So the bosses of the regulators, like Wayne Byers at APRA, who, remember, got away scot-free from the Royal Commission. ASIC got a towel up, but they got away scot-free. He's telling Parliament, yeah, we don't have any concerns. But his letter, this is in the David Ross article in The Australian yesterday, APRA Chairman Wayne Byers told the banks in the letter dated April 23rd that the lending growth was coming in a backdrop of extraordinarily low interest rates, high household indebtedness and accelerating housing prices. Given the importance of mortgage lending to the balance sheet of the banking system, it is important for the resilience of the system that standards for new lending remain prudent and responsive to changing market conditions. So why would you, if you're warning them that, why would you reduce the standards in the law?
Yeah.
Right? APRA, quote, APRA expects banks, and particularly the largest lenders, right, duh, I'm singling you out, Big Four, to be especially vigilant in managing the risks within their residential mortgage portfolios in the current environment. APRA would not expect to see a bank relax its risk appetite limits at this time. And that alone, that also tells you, if the banks had that capacity to relax their risk appetite limits, why do they need Josh Frydenberg to weaken responsible lending laws? Yep. Why? It's the whole thing was an absolute charade. Now, I was talking in our office this morning about this. We call Scott Morrison Mr. Caveat Emptor, and we put up a press release about that a couple of years ago when he became the leader. And the reason we call him that is because when the Royal Commission was on in 2018, the Banking Royal Commission, he doubled down and said we need to make sure that personal responsibility is the cornerstone of the financial system, right? Now, that was an echo of a few weeks earlier. He didn't use the term caveat emptor, but Wayne Byers had. This same Wayne Byers had used this term and he said, we can't lose the principle of caveat emptor in the system. And what's caveat emptor? Let the buyer beware. Latin for let the buyer beware. But the way it's applied in Australia, it's basically if you're ripped off by financial predators, it's your own fault, right? However, by any measure, caveat emptor cannot work. It's a stupid principle, and there's a limited application. Let's put it that way, right? It cannot work, even in a limited form, if the people in the equation don't have full information.
Yep.
Right, and that's what we've talked about the Sterling First scandal in Western Australia. These pensioners that are all about to be evicted and thrown out in the street, ASIC didn't tell them before they went into this scheme that the people running this scheme had a history a mile long of losing people's money in schemes. That information wasn't available to them. So caveat emptor cannot work. And the same applies to the banks. But also the principle in general should just be thought of as a more general principle that it must also apply between the regulator and the Parliament, which is the ultimate authority. If the boss of the regulator doesn't tell Parliament the full information, but he's privately writing letters to the banks acknowledging what their actual concerns are, there's no way this principle can work, right? The whole thing's a joke. In its application, it's a joke. They have a rigged system when it comes to the banks to make sure that between them and the government, that the RBA, the settings are always tweaked in the bank's favour, even if every now and then they have to, in a rather wet lettuce way, warn the banks, hey, there's issues here. Don't lose your perspective on what this is, and that itself should be considered a bigger deal than it is. We have a one-trick pony economy, which is the housing bubble, and they know that there is real stability issues there. That's the subtext of that letter. That's the unspoken part. But they never want to acknowledge that publicly. That's essentially the underlying issue, and that's why you've got to expose this. But you've got to be thinking in terms of how would the financial system work that should replace this one? right? And we are fundamentally of the view that it's got to include the public banking element. That's where the stability comes from. Principles like Glass-Steagall, so you still have the private financial system that can do its thing, but it's within a framework that's fundamentally stable because it's focused on the real economy, right, as the primary purpose of the financial system, and you don't have to regulate all the crazy speculation, but you keep it outside the fence so it doesn't affect the real economy. And that's how you create a stable system. Instead, these people are creating their definition of financial stability is let the banks do what they like and constantly tweak things behind the scenes and keep the information away from the public so that it's the households and the individual home buyers that wear the crashes when they happen and not the banks.
Yep. The old socialise the losses and privatise the profits, right? The fundamental principle of neoliberalism. And I'll make two quick points. The first is that both Philip Lowe and Wayne Byers don't think they've got any accountability for house prices, right? So although they're pulling all the levers, they actually say they've got no accountability for the outcome of rising house prices and housing affordability. And I also would say that in my data, I've seen a deterioration in lending standards significantly, strongly happening over the last few months, right? So the average first-time buyer is getting a loan that's 15% bigger this year than last year, despite the fact that incomes have not risen, right? 15% bigger. And that is just laying a bigger and bigger bear trap eventually. Eventually, this will all go crashing, right? What's being done at the moment is basically just trying to paper over the cracks and trying to waffle our way through over the next election, right? And not addressing the fundamental structural issues we have. We have to get our banking system back on an even keel, absolutely. Remove all the speculative element, remove all the one-sided advantage of the big players versus everybody else, right? We need a banking system that supports our economy, supports individuals and households and businesses in what they're trying to do. That's the transformational change that we need. The evidence is so clear we need it, and we actually have a path that we can actually point to do it. So this should be something which should be right at the top of the agenda of the political debate, and my view is that it should be something which should be an electoral issue coming up next May or whenever it is.
Oh, for sure. People don't have to sit in their hands in the meantime, though. What I do suggest people do is, if you support the policy, get involved in our campaign for a postal bank. And there's two parts to that. There's getting the word out, building the support for it. Like we're doing, you can get on our website, see our resolution that we've drafted, have this draft resolution that people send to their local councils and saying, will you pass this as a motion at your council meeting and endorse this as a resolution? So you can say that, we will council and want to endorse the idea of a postal bank. And so you can be involved in that. It's not hard to do, and you can begin a discussion with your local councillors. It's actually good to talk to and know your local councillors. It's the most responsive level of democracy, really, because they do have to look after the people in their wards, etc. So that's very, very useful. A lot of them are part of the political parties anyway, and then that's how you can also be influencing them. So you get on our website and look at that. But also the other side of it is we kicked open a can of worms with this Australia Post story. It's a glimpse into the corruption, right? And the Senate inquiry was excellent, but there's unfinished business, and it relates to this board and the minister. And that Senate inquiry said, we're going to look further at Lucio Di Bartolomeo and see whether he should be referred to the Privileges Committee for misleading Parliament. And we're going to look at the Minister Paul Fletcher to see whether his order to get rid of Christine Holgate was illegal. Now, the way that works in practice is someone, and probably someone who was on that inquiry, has to get up in the Senate and move a motion to refer the chair to the Privileges Committee. Now, they haven't done that yet. So you can call Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, who's the chair of the committee, and she did a really good job, right? Call her office up and say, and a lot of calls would be great. Call up the office and say, will you refer Lucio Di Bartolomeo to the Privileges Committee? Because the call you make, you're actually making on behalf of your local post office. The pressure we apply is pressure, in a good sense, that forces them to realize you are not going to get away with going back to that kind of corruption that just ruined all those people's lives for so long, right? So that's something you can do. The other person on the committee who's probably, more likely than the others to move the motion would be Pauline Hanson, who moved the inquiry. And even though Senator Hanson and Senator Hanson-Young are by any measure political enemies, I was watching these hearings, all of them, closely. They worked very well together in this inquiry. They knew they were on the same page. It was a very important issue. So Pauline Hanson could be the one to do that. What they usually do in the Senate is they'll negotiate with all the different groups and say, will you support this, etc., before they move the motion. And it'll come down to the Labor Party and the Greens and the crossbenchers all saying, yeah, refer this chairman to the Privileges Committee, because this is a guy, while he wasn't there in 2018, his job, he knew how good a CEO Christine Holgate was, but he was appointed for a different purpose, which was to facilitate this privatisation of Australia Post. And so when at the point where he should have defended her, because he's the chair of that CEO, he threw her under a bus and claimed that he would never have approved $5,000 in watches. And he's now approving $250,000 in retention bonuses. He's a hypocrite. He's a liar. He's a stooge of the government. And it's fully exposed. He should be held accountable through that. There's a proper process to do it. So you make a call. We can put the two senators' numbers there. Please pick up the phone and make a call and be one of lots of people making those calls. And let's get some heat in this, right? Because otherwise, you don't ever adopt the attitude that, it's the whole system's so corrupt. There's no point doing anything, right? I understand that attitude. But if you convince yourself not to even try, you'll never, ever have another attitude. Whereas we have experienced in our own time doing this together, Martin, that there's been any number of issues, we've focused on it, and we've got fundamental breakthroughs. Right? And this is one we can have it too.
Yeah, well, there's an old saying that says a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, right? Yep. You just have to take the first step and then the next step. And this is a good example of a step we can take now to keep the pressure on. And we know where we have to head. We know what the outcome needs to be. And there is an opportunity to make a difference now. And that's what I keep saying to people, don't just turn the other way and say, it's too hard, it's too complicated, we'll never get anywhere, right? The truth is, taking those steps can make a huge difference. And if we're purposeful and know why we're doing it and where we're heading, as we do quite clearly, then there is an opportunity. And the reason we're doing this is because this is in the long-term interests of Australians and Australia, households and businesses, because there has to be a change, because the current mode of operation is great for them, boosting the profits of the large banks. We're seeing consolidation more and more amongst the big players, but it's not fit for purpose. It's not serving the real needs of the real economy, and that's what we're talking about here.
And the other saying, when you think about how overwhelmingly corrupt this system is, is that's just as good as the best time to plant a tree is 30 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is today. Right? Don't say the opportunity is past. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the system is completely, all these things we've said is true, but there's no time like the present to get stuck into it.
Yeah, there's a third one is this is the first day of the rest of our lives, right? There's always a chance to make a difference going forward. So, Robbie, we've been very philosophical at the end here, but I think it's important. We'll put some links and things below. Thank you very much for sharing some of your thoughts with me and the audience, and we'll come back again and pick this up, because this is a really, really important issue for Australia and Australians.
And when I get home, my kids will tell me I need anger management. So I'll go and sign up for one.
Well, but sometimes a bit of anger is actually quite useful just to make the point. So I'm not too concerned. Anyway, right. Thank you. See you later. Cheers.